In the previous video, we saw the differences between authentication and authorization. In this video, let's see the flow of authentication. And understanding this is really crucial to master authentication and authorization. So let's get into it. General authentication flow is the series of steps that happen when you try to access a secure resources. It is like knocking on a locked door and proving to the owner that you are the right person to let in. In a typical web application, the authentication flow often begins when a user submits a username and password. The system then checks these credentials against a database or other storage system. If they are valid, the system then checks these credentials against a database or a different storage system. If they are valid, the system creates a session or generates a token for the user, marking them as authenticated. From then on, this session or token or cookie is used to identify the user for the duration of their interaction with the application, allowing them to access protected resources. Now let's see this analog. Imagine you are logging into your favorite online game. You enter your username and password and hit logged in, and boom, you are in the game. Behind the scenes, the game checks your login info, and if it is correct, you get a gamer badge that lets you play, access your saved games, buy new levels, and so on. That whole process of entering your info and getting the badge is the authentication flow. Now let's see this diagram. In real-world applications, and that is for full-stack applications, we have these entities. The client over here. Remember, in web application, the client is not the real user, but instead, the tool that the user is using to access the application is called the client. If the user is using browser, for example Chrome, the browser here is the client. And for testing APIs, we can use what is called Postman or Insomnia, and these are the client. So the application knows this but not the real person. So now we have the client. Next is that we need our server, because this is where the entire business logic resides. And also we need a data storage. And for us, we are going to use MongoDB. So let's look at the flow. At this point, we assume that the user has been registered. So we are going to focus on the logging in process. Let's say that the user is trying to access our server, which are protected, meaning unless the user is logged in. So first, the user will submit a request to log in with a password or username or with different authentication system. Here, let's say that the user is logging in with a username and password. So first step is that it's going to hit our server. Based on the implementation of our server, the user needs to be verified. So over here, the system will now take the user details and send to our data storage, in this case MongoDB. And in case the user info is inside the database, then the database will send a response back to the server and say that user account is valid or found. But in case the user is not found, then the database will say that, hey, invalid login credentials. So the response from the DB will now send to our server, and our server will now send the response back to the user. Either the login was successful or not. At this point, we are assuming that the user details are valid. Now our server has now got the user details. The next step is that our server will now find a way to provide some identifier to this user. So before our server will find some identifier that's going to represent the user, the server will need what is called authentication methods. Because HTTP servers are stateless, meaning that as soon as a user is logged in, the server does not remember the logged in user. So we need to find a way to persist the user by providing some identifier to the user. And for this approach, we call it as authentication methods. And we can use what is called cookie-based authentication, meaning that this is going to generate some cookies or some random string of numbers and give it to the logged in user. So at this point, our server knows the cookies but not the logged in user with the username and password. And we can also use what is called sessions. And all of these also provide some identifier to the logged in user. And we can also use token-based authentication, or we can use OAuth. And that is, we can use third-party libraries like Passport. But for this, we are going to focus on these three authentications. So we are going to take them one after the other and go through and see how we are going to use this to implement authentication. So assuming that we are using the cookie-based authentication. So over here, the server is going to generate some identifier to represent the user. And these cookies will be saved into the client. When using the browser, it's going to be saved inside the browser automatically. At this point, let's say that the user is trying to access some protected resources or endpoint. The user needs to send the cookie along with the request so that the server will check and see that, is this the cookie that I generated? Then the server will compare, and if it is valid, then the user will be allowed to access the resource or the resources. The same process is for session-based authentication. The difference here is that instead of saving the token or the sessions inside the browser, is going to be saved on the server. And for token, it follows the same principles. Don't worry, we are going to take them step by step. The takeaway here is understand how the authentication flow works. Now, in summary, the general authentication flow is a sequence of steps used to verify a user's identity when they try to access a secured service or application. This process usually starts with the user providing credentials like a username and password, which the system then verifies. Once authenticated, the user is granted a session or token that they use to access further secured resources. In the next video, we will begin with cookie-based authentication. Let's get into it in the next video.